On.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, I've enjoyed your channel so far and a couple of the other channels that have arisen recently in this field, like Anamnesis, who I'm sure you're aware of as well.
Yeah, actually, I've been talking to him a little bit, hoping to do something with him soon. Also, he does some great work, and that's one of the reasons I'm excited to have you on, because I know most of the people who are going to be watching this have probably already seen your stuff before. But I know that as I was getting into Moldbug, I'd heard of Moldbug before, but I had not done the reading myself. And as I was preparing to kind of dive into that, watching a lot of your series about Moldbug kind of prepared me to absorb some of those ideas. So I've been a big fan of your work as well.
Oh, very good to hear. I mean, that's always great to hear. I mean, that's kind of why I made the videos. You know, it is a lot to take in, and it's difficult to introduce people to. Interesting thing, I actually rewatched some of those videos in preparation for the stream I did with Sargon and Settler's Lament.
Mm-hmm.
And I see why people like them so much, just because one of the things I did in that video, or that video series, was sort of apply what Moldbug was writing back in the early 2000s to things that were happening with Trump, and even laid out a few predictions for what would happen now using what Moldbug said, and all of it rings pretty true still. So yeah, that gives me a lot of confidence in where Moldbug is going with his newer writings, which we were just talking. But we can get into that later.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that. And I also think anyone who hasn't watched the last couple videos of yours discussing bioleninism, that's one of those concepts that is so powerful that once you kind of unlock it, you can't stop seeing it everywhere you turn.
Yeah, the weird thing about that is I read those essays probably like 2 or 3 years ago, and they were kind of on my radar. But I think when I first read them, I didn't quite get them. But after I reread them a couple months ago, it really clicked with me. And yeah, so this bioleninism concept is just really powerful stuff. Everyone needs to read that essay.
Yeah, there's a lot of philosophical and political science works that I've read early on and then come back to them like a decade later, like stuff like After Virtue with Alasdair MacIntyre, or even some of the Aristotle stuff. And it's just sometimes it's got to hit you at the right time, in the right and the people who are really seeing the future will say things that you just don't, the time hasn't quite come to process it. And then once you can kind of see it in context, it opens up a whole new world. So
yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk about Curtis Yarvin, Moldbug, and also Neoreaction a little bit. But to get started, I was interested in maybe getting your definition, because there's a lot of people discussing Neoreaction now, talking about the dissonant right and some of these ideas, but it can often be difficult to get a kind of a clear idea of what people mean by it, because it means so many things to so many people. And I think the good thing is it is a broad umbrella. But for you, what got you into Neoreaction? Were you like handed Moldbug at some point, or did you stumble on it? And what does that mean to you? What do you see Neoreaction as?
So the way I found Neoreaction is, I just kind of signed up for Discord in like 2015 or 16 or something like that. And, this was sort of right in the midst of and after Trump got elected. And, I was really looking for some explanation of what was going on that actually made any sense, trying to diagnose the problem, because, I think it was obvious, and still is obvious to everyone, that something is incredibly wrong with our current civilization, and it's really difficult to actually define. And just people I would talk with in voice chat on Discord would mention various people, and I heard the name Moldbug a couple of times, and it sounded like something I ought to look into. So I basically went and looked for Moldbug on my own, and found the Unqualified Reservations blog, and found the open letter first, and just read the whole thing. And it was probably the first time I had read any political, or really any kind of work, that I found just so utterly compelling in terms of providing an explanation that just made sense to me on so many levels. This was in like 2017 or so, I think, that I had read it, which was really funny, because I read Moldbug, and really got into what he was selling right before I went on this trip to Washington, D.C. for the first time, which made the experience a lot different than it would have been otherwise, as you can imagine. So that's how I got into Moldbug. And then in terms of what Neoreaction actually is, I think what Neoreaction primarily is a set of analytical tools and ideas that provide a diagnosis. I think it's expanding into solutions. Moldbug has tried solutions in the past, and obviously there are other thinkers outside of Moldbug, like Spandrel, for example, or Nick Land. But none of these guys really provide solutions to the same degree that they provide a diagnosis. However, like I said, I think it might evolve over time as Neoreaction continues its development. I used to view Neoreaction as kind of a done thing, right? Like Neoreaction was this thing that happened and it provided us with some useful stuff, and then we're going to move beyond it. But I think with what Mold has been doing recently, I think Neoreaction still has somewhere to take us, and is still going to evolve as its own philosophy. And so that's going to be interesting in of itself. And specifically what I think it is as a positive set of ideas, I think Neoreaction, it's fundamentally, in terms of economics, it's Austrian. In terms of its system of government, it's pronomian, pro-order, anti-democratic for the most part, and based on, it's hard to put your finger on it. Some aspect of truth and realism. I think Neoreaction is very interested in truth, specifically in terms of objectivity. In fact, Moldbug puts a pretty serious emphasis on this in what he's writing in The Gray Mirror. And I think you see this thread throughout many neo-reactionaries. You see it in Spandrel's writing as well, in his bio-Leninism thesis, in terms of, the truth about, certain biological aspects of humanity. Same thing in Nick Land, if you read what he has to say on, technology and where that's taking us. So it's hard to really lump all of this together. I think, if you think back to the whole neo-reactionary trichotomy idea that Spandrel put out, there are kind of different branches of neo-reaction, and it might not be the case that it is a single coherent entity in the long run, but I think at least for the time being, we can at least agree that neo-reaction is generally interested in developing a more orderly society that provides us with certain liberties. It's very liberty and order focused in a very classical American sort of way, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I think that conceiving of it as kind of a power analysis first is really useful, because that allows you to bring a lot of thinkers who may not agree on a lot of things or may come from a lot of different backgrounds, but have similar critiques and understanding of the way government is currently structured and the way these kind of things work. And it allows them to kind of exist under an umbrella that reaches, I think, outside of kind of the liberal narrative. And by this, we mean, more the classical liberal narrative, not like the Democrats, but it allows them to reach outside of that narrative and look to kind of older understandings of kind of power and sovereignty and the way that countries actually run and the way civilizations actually work. And like you said, really being in touch with the reality of things rather than the story. Mm-hmm. I think is a very important aspect of it. And that's what draws me to it, is whatever comes out of it. And I do think that's something that is exciting about what's happening, is, we are watching this kind of develop in real time. And so, and many different people are a part of it. And so I do think that that's exciting, but that's also why it doesn't have a lot of answers yet. And for good reason. I think that's because a lot of people, the chessboard isn't laid out yet. And mm-hmm. So while, as you pointed out, it was something that a lot of people might have thought was dead when Yarvin stopped writing on unqualified reservations, the explanatory power of that analysis has been so important that it's kind of brought it back into the forefront, because it just predicted things and saw things that nothing else did. and so I think that's what gives it a lot of the following that it has now. But the aspect, and we can go on about all kinds of stuff about Neoreaction, but the aspect I specifically wanted to talk to you about, because I don't see as many other people in the Neoreactionary sphere focus on it as much, but I've heard you talk about it a little more, is kind of the concept of the media run state. Because I'm someone who, my degree's in political science, I worked in politics, I worked in Republican politics, I was a reporter, I was a political reporter for a number of years, and so this is it's a field I'm familiar with. And one of the things that hit me, I was listening to I think it was the open letter or the introduction, I forget which one, but I was they have the computer read voice that does the somebody turned those into videos, and so I was going for a walk and I was listening to that, and when I heard that line from Yarvin about everyone has a concept of a state-run media, but do you have a concept of a media-run state? And it just hit me like a lightning bolt. I knew exactly what he meant when he said that. And so I was wondering if you could maybe expound a little bit on what he means by the idea of having a media-run state when he's talking about that.
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty easy to understand if you think of it in terms, which I think is the ones he uses in the letter, is in terms of a church-controlled state, right? If you think about what a church-controlled state or a theocratic state is, you could think of pretty much any example of that. I mean, you could think of fictional or non-fictional examples. Think like Warhammer 40K on the fiction side, or whatever your conception of the Dark Ages were, and the Christian Church being this bad guy, which I don't think is has the truth value that some people like to think, but we have that conception, right? So it's very easy to understand what a theocracy is. What a mediocrity is, we don't really have a conception for it, but it's basically like a theocracy, right? Because the same thing happens. Basically, you have this idea, this religion that gets propagated by some institution that's not really accountable in any way, and it basically becomes a religion or pseudo-religion. And on the converse side, we have this understanding. We know what it is to suppress a religion through the government. I mean, that's happening right now for Christians in the Western world. And we also know what it is to suppress the media or the press using the government as well. And, you can take plenty of examples from fascist Europe or communist Europe or whatever with this sort of thing. And of course, now in the United States, in our nice liberal democracy, we have certain oppression of the media going on our side, as we would conceive of it. So, we all understand what these things are sort of at just an implicit level, but then you run into the media controlled state, and you kind of have to do what I just did and come up with this weird set of analogies to even understand what it is. And, Moldbug explains that, this is this way so that you don't see it, right? It's this hole in your conception of what the relationship between media and government is specifically there, so that you don't recognize the fact that the media really is not even like a fourth branch of government in U.S. terms, but really like the Uber branch that is sort of above the others, and also in this eminently unaccountable state. And, if you really sit down and think about it, what are politicians actually doing? What are they able to do? Who are they accountable? It starts to become obvious that the people who really drive where politics in the Western world is going right now are the journalists. It's not even the lobbyists, right? Because even the lobbyists at the end of the day are going to be lobbying based on certain interests that are promulgated to them by the cathedral itself, right? And some of these are just base financial interests that might more or less be neutral in terms of the atheocratic religion that he describes. But many of these lobbying efforts are going to be driven by what is promulgated from the media, aka the cathedral itself. So at the end of the day, it's really the media that is very much in control, because they're in control of the narrative, right? And the narrative is really what defines where the civilization goes on a broad level. So you control that. You sort of control everything that people are thinking, even internally, right? If you control the narrative, you actually control, to some extent, the private thoughts of individuals, even when they're not thinking about politics per se, just going about their day-to-day lives. You have this you sort of have your fingers in their brain, and that's really what the media controlled state is. It's this insidious system that is in everyone's heads, even in our heads. The way we think is still affected by these narratives we've been fed our entire lives by this institution of the media. So that would be, I guess, my somewhat long-winded explanation of what that means.
No, exactly. That's a great explanation, and what I think is really interesting is one of Yarvin's biggest knocks on democracy is that he does a really good job of explaining the difference between formal and informal power, because we talk about checks and balances and Montesquieu's separation of powers, and how the American Constitution is so careful to federalize things and put things into different branches and restrict the different powers of the government. But what it doesn't do is restrict all the formal powers in theory, but it doesn't restrict informal power. And so the press is entirely unrestricted, media apparatus, education, culture, tastemakers, all these things are unrestricted, even though they wield as much, if not more, power in a democracy, because in a democracy, you're not being as formal about what it takes to rule. Like, you're not being clear that force is what actually generates your sovereignty. And so because you're trying to hide the ball, what you do is you control, rather than controlling people physically, you have to control them mentally. The way you hold power in a democracy is by getting votes, and the way you get votes is to control the information flow, because people don't actually see events happen. They're not actually at places where things happen. They don't understand or attend like meetings where laws get passed and discussed. And so who do they rely for this information? Who do they rely on for this information? Educators, teachers, reporters, media entities, celebrities. And so if you can control those aspects, the media, then you're controlling the information, and therefore you're controlling the democracy. And so one of the things that I found fascinating thinking about this is, do you think that the media-controlled state is more a function of democracy, or is it a function of democracy that developed alongside the technology? Because I don't know that without the era of mass media, we could have generated this kind of system. I don't think that anyone would have been able to take control through the media apparatus the way they do now. And one of the things Moldbug has talked about in his new work is how social media only accelerates this process through the level of kind of interconnectivity through that technology. So I was wondering what you thought about maybe these co-developments and how they interact.
Yeah, I would say democracy probably amplifies this effect. I think this effect has been happening for a long time. I think people have media for hundreds of years at this point. But the thing about modern technology is I think it's enabled this press-controlled state on a level way beyond what could have possibly been achieved otherwise. Like, maybe at a lower technological state, the media could exert a similar level of influence on like a state level or local level. If you think back to 1800s United States, but now we're at the point where everyone is so connected, we can actually share a narrative. Like, it's hard to imagine someone in Texas in the year 1800 sharing a narrative with someone in New Hampshire in 1800, right? Because they're in completely different conditions and they're sort of engaged with reality more. And so I don't really think the rate at which the media could actually tell these stories would have worked without the instant access, homogenized society we have now. So I do think that technology not necessarily causes this, but it wouldn't be possible without the type of technology we have now. But of course, that doesn't mean we turn away from the technology. We wouldn't want to, even if we could. I think I think we can separate technology from life being awful. I mean, in general, I think people tend to agree that technology has made human existence better in many ways, maybe not spiritually better in some ways, but I think this is a problem to resolve, not to go Philistine mode on and just smash it. So that's the technology aspect. Democracy, it's pretty obvious, I think, that democracy amplifies the effect when you just think about how democracy works. I mean, you can't really have a press-controlled state, I think, to the same extent when it's hard for me to imagine if we had like an aristocracy, the aristocrats being as susceptible to the media narrative as just the masses are. I think it's a lot easier to sort of energize this democratic creature with certain stories that appeal to their base desires. Like just the punishing of one's enemies, right? We see this happening right now. If aristocrats want to punish their enemies, they have a lot more elegant ways to go about it that don't necessarily require like this sort of narrative behind it coming from someone else. So I think democracy does amplify this media effect.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think another interesting aspect is that, part of, I think, what allows the media to have the grasp that it does is also kind of our modern disconnectedness. I agree with you, absolutely. We don't want to go Luddite. Like, we're not looking to go back and destroy the technology here, but we do need to understand, Patrick Deneen has a great book, Why Liberalism Failed, which I'm gonna be lobbying hard for it to be like introduced to any official neo-reactionary canon, because I think it's fantastic. But in it, he talks about how technology we develop is a reflection of our values. We develop technology that fulfills our ends, and our ends are tied to our value structure. And so the fact that we are so individualized and atomized, we're spread out across this very large American empire with very little in common anymore in many ways. We've diversified so much that we don't have common culture. We don't have these connections. Most people have move away from their families to work and go to school. They no longer have those community bonds. And so the fact that we are so individualized and atomized and push away from our communities means that we rely more and more on these media and information outlets to give us an idea of like what to think and what to feel and how to interact. We don't have that natural feedback anymore, and so we seek it more and more often. When people come home from their 10 hours at whatever pointless job, they don't go hang out with their friends. They sit in their little concrete cell and watch Netflix until they fall asleep. And so I think that people are even more plugged into this. And I think one of the best demonstrations of that has been the COVID outbreak and the subsequent lockdowns. One of the reasons I think people have gone so crazy, there are many reasons, but I think one of them is when you finally completely shut people off from all socialization, the only thing they have left to connect with is social media and 24-hour cable news. And the results are very visible, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a follower of Stoic philosophy to some extent, and it's even starting to bother me at this point where I haven't seen people I used to see every week for like 4 or 5 months at this point, and not even because it's illegal, because they literally feel that they need to hide from society in order to not die and not kill their grandparents, basically. So it is extremely stressful, and you can see how this is sort of feeding into this ridiculous rioting and other sorts of backlash we have right now, because we've been just bottling up all of this energy, and this should really surprise no one, I think. I mean, this is just what happens when you instigate your population to become highly politically engaged and then try to box them into their concrete living spaces for months and months at a time. I wanted to say something on the technology front. Oh yeah. So one of the interesting things about technology atomizing us, technology was supposed to be this great connector of people, and it kind of has to some extent, but at a deeper level, it has really disconnected all of us. It's a very weird thing that's happening. But I do think, and I mentioned this in a previous stream a few days ago, we do need I think we need to lean into technology to reestablish those connections and not try to turn away from it just because there is no other option in front of us. And I have actually seen positive things going on in this area in some of the communities I hang out with. So like there's this basket weaving club that's mostly in the UK right now, but it's like a Discord server started by academic agents community, and they've actually had some. I think they did their first meetups just last week, and people went and hung out at the pub with other right wingers. In real life during this lockdown, and met people even outside the community who they don't even talk to online, right? They just met people in their local area, and it's called basket weaving because it's sort of an inside joke, but the idea is to actually connect people and get them re-engaged with each other in real life, and it actually seems to be working, which I think is very interesting. And it would be cool to see more of this happen in all of the online communities we have, not to just drop out of them, but to use these communities to reestablish those connections.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to be clear, I'm certainly with you when it comes to leaning into technology, because there's it's so hard to disseminate a lot of this information and explore this information with other people who are kind of noticing these problems and are able to talk about them. And so the only way to connect with people about this stuff is in a lot of ways through technology, and you can't put this genie back in the bottle. So the answer to solving this problem is certainly not to just abandon the technology, but it's exactly what you're talking about. It's building those in real life communities. I'm someone who does have a fair amount of experience, kind of be involved in political communities and connections and that kind of thing through the different career paths I've had, and so I totally understand the value, and I'm really excited to hear that there are people working on ways to kind of create these in real life bonds, because that's the stuff that's really going to energize people. Hitting play on a YouTube video when your favorite creator comes up is great and all, and staying in contact on Twitter or something is fine, but it's it is those shared drinks at the pub that's really going to move this from some online YouTube Discord community into something that's much more tangible with positive impacts in people's lives. So I'm certainly a big fan of you guys working on that, and I hope that's something a lot of people will get involved in. But coming back to the media run state, I did want to talk about one more thing, which is how it's becoming even, I think, much more obvious even to some of the normies about where this is coming from, because we're starting to see what are basically people who have done absolutely nothing wrong, would in no sane world be charged with a crime, suddenly be magically guilty of a crime because the media writes a story about it. And so we're seeing political officials completely change their positions overnight, depending on what CNN or even New York Times published, and actually actively taking political prosecutions and attempting to put people in jail or even on death row simply for being on the wrong side of the New York Times.
Yeah, so this actually gets into some of the mechanics of the press-controlled state, which I think are pretty interesting. So Moldbug has written recently about following laws and informal laws, and there are formal laws which come from the government as most people would understand it, but then there's also the informal ones, which are just as powerful and potentially crushing as actual laws are. And these informal laws come from the Cathedral, which is in large part the media. And people, especially Americans, don't really like that, because in the United States, we sort of have this idea, we have a formalist idea of how government is supposed to be laid out, right? And when people start to realize it's not actually laid out in the way that it is supposed to be, and in a way that they actually participate in, that is likely to get them very angry. And when you see your politicians shift like this, obviously in front of the media, what that's doing is it's telling the average person that their politicians aren't serving them, they're serving something else, they're serving the media. And I think one of the things that's helping amplify this is you look at what just happened with Tucker Carlson, right? And the New York Times going after him to such a high degree. You sort of see this power struggle going on in the media at absolutely vicious levels. And when you see that happen, you have to wonder, why are these people fighting so viciously like this? The only real reason could be for power, right? You would never have the New York Times going after Tucker Carlson so viciously for any other reason, I would imagine. So I think this fight is starting to become publicized, and it really gets to people because they come to understand, I guess, proto neo-reactionary ideas regarding who's really holding the reins, and people don't like being lied to, and that's really, I think, what it all comes down to is that they find out that this thing that they're supposed to believe in, and in turn it's going to look after them, is actually not at all what it claims to be.
Well, I think the Tucker Carlson example is really good, and I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's an interesting topic of discussion too. So, for those who aren't familiar, most of you probably are, but Tucker Carlson, basically, New York Times was going to run a hit piece on him in which they were going to reveal key details about where he lived. And one of the things I really like about what Tucker Carlson did is, rather than just kind of take this on the chin or give a weak rebuke like a lot of people in the right wing would do, he knew what this was. This is a not so veiled threat on himself and his children. The man's already had mobs come to his own home, and his wife has had to call the police, like, locked in their closet. And so what he did is he said, these people are running this story, and here are their names and here are their pictures. And I don't think Tucker Carlson's a stupid person. So I think he knew what would happen after he named the names and showed the pictures. And what he did is he preempted the threat. And I think that was a master stroke, because he did it in a way where it was subtle. It was not direct, but it also showed the right finally being willing to step up and say, no, you don't get a free pass on this. We're not going to be playing by Marcus of Queensberry rules with you anymore. You want to bring a knife, we're bringing a gun. So and so I was very happy to see him make that move, because it's honestly the first time I can think of in a long time where I've watched someone on the right really take it back to the left that way and put them on notice. Like, if you're going to come after my family, I will make sure that you feel that, and you'll feel it immediately.
Yeah, it's really a weird thing, because you normally think of Fox News as what's the British term, Her Majesty's Royal Opposition or something along those lines, right? That's how they're normally viewed. But if you saw the loyal opposition suddenly go for the jugular against the rulers, you're like, whoa, what's going on here? This is not normal at all. Something completely out of the ordinary is happening, and now you're going to be intently focused on that. So really interesting to watch this Tucker Carlson situation develop, especially as we get closer and closer to the election, because one can only imagine that the viciousness of it is going to ramp itself up. I mean, we saw they just tried to Kavanaugh him, I think is the correct verbiage there.
Yeah.
And my feel here is that that's just going to totally bounce off, because it's just, there's just no basis for us. And everyone kind of knows this game at this point, right? Like, oh, it's like, how many times can you just make the same exact sort of cloudy sexual harassment accusation against powerful people before everyone starts to get wind of the game? I mean, right?
There is a diminishing return to the October surprise. Yes, as people have gotten used to this tactic of just pulling out a laundry list of sexual allegations 2 or 3 weeks before something important happens, and hoping that just the stink around it kind of handles it. And what this has done is just made people callous to these accusations entirely. But yeah, I really thought it was interesting to watch him take that tact. And I think the right is going to have to learn in all kinds of arenas that it's got to stop trying to take the high ground on this stuff, because it's a losing strategy. The left is not playing by these rules. They're not going to. They're playing for keeps. They're going to take the whole thing if you let them, and they will take your standards and beat you to death with them if you allow them to. And so I do think that it's an interesting development that some people on the right are finally trying to grasp this. There's a columnist at the New York Post. I'm trying to remember his last name. Sareem. Anyway, I can't remember it immediately. But he's kind of become one of the rare advocates for this position is, look, the right needs to learn to use, to use power. And if it continues to pretend like the left is playing by these same rules, it will continuously lose, because it's starting itself off, 10 miles behind the starting line.
Yeah, it's interesting. The last thing you said about the right needing to learn to use power, because I think this gets into some of Moldbug's more recent writings, and something we were discussing right before the stream started is it seems like that's kind of a thing that just doesn't work at all. So like, we understand that we don't have power and we want it, but at the same time, there doesn't seem to be any sensible path to achieve that. And it seems like the Gray Mirror Project is basically Moldbug trying to lay that out for us. But so I actually just read the Gray Mirror, the first like 4 posts right before we started. That was very interesting stuff. What do you think about the right using power? I mean, like, do you have any conception of how we can actually successfully go about that?
Well, I think you're right, and so I've made some videos on kind of the material from the Gray Mirror posts, and I think you're right that as we sit now, the right doesn't have power, doesn't have access to power. I think what I would talk about more is the right needs to understand what forces are in play, and when it makes its move, when it does have those options, it needs to understand what tactics work and what don't. And so I think one of the things that Yarvin has been talking a lot about in Gray Mirror is basically like, you just don't have access to the levers of power, and trying to play the game by the rules of the system when you don't have access to the levers of power is basically just political pornography. You're just acting in an attempt to feel important, because you've been told that in our system people fight back and people have fat power and individuals can make a difference, and you've been told that it's your duty to get involved in these political maneuvers in order to move the ball forward. And I think what he's pointing out is what that really does is just gets you to play a rigged game. You're like the guy sitting down at a slot machine, putting his 300th quarter into the slot machine and pulling the lever, hoping it finally works for him this time, because really there's no other game in town. And I think what Moldbug is saying is, what the right needs to understand is, it's never going to win this game, and you're only feeding the system by putting your quarters in the slot machine. So just stand up and walk away and do something else until there's another game to play. Because the game available to you now is rigged against you, and you're just paying the house to let them crush you every time.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, that this idea of detachment, because in Moldbug's latest writings, I feel like I've been red-pilled again. Like, it feels like there's kind of multiple layers to the red pill, like of the red pill. Like, the first layer is sort of seeing through the base narratives and becoming a dissonant. But now it's clear to me that I think the next level of being red-pilled is seeing through how being a dissonant isn't actually any better than being the collaborator, as Moldbug explains it. And this is I think very humbling, but something we have to realize is that being a dissonant isn't actually the right thing to do. And basically most of everything we've done so far on the dissonant right has just been the wrong thing to do. And that's actually not a problem, as long as we stay on the path of finding the right answer. And it's interesting, because I don't know what the answer is, and I'm hoping Moldbug can provide something that makes sense to me, and I think he will. But we had a stream 2 days ago on Settlers Laments channel, and it's interesting, right? Because the question was, should we abandon politics? And I think all our gut instincts are kind of pointing towards yes, but we can't just say yes, because we feel like we have to offer some sort of alternative, right? So we don't just want to do nothing. And I think that's not what the clear pill is about. It's not about doing nothing, but it's about identifying the many, many, many wrong things we've been doing as dissidents, and just not doing those things anymore. And so I think we kind of have to accept this idea that, yes, we do need to abandon politics, and we don't necessarily know yet what that means, but we need to figure it out. And it's interesting too. Moldbug uses this analogy of heroin a lot for some weird reason. And when you get off of heroin, which is kind of like what politics is, you don't just do it cold turkey or you'll die. Maybe for our own mental stability, we need to sort of wean ourselves out of politics and not just drop out of it completely. Which I think is kind of what we got at in that stream, is like we all kind of understand that we need to disengage from politics, but we don't understand what we're going to be engaging into alternatively. And it feels like just giving up and losing to do that disengagement. And yet we're in this paradoxical situation where we recognize that the game is unwinnable. So I think we just have to kind of humbly accept how many wrong things we've done and really think very hard about what we're going to do instead of that game, which doesn't involve any sort of dissident activity or the display of power, right? Because that was why I asked that question, is because when you actually try to use any sort of power against the sovereign regime, it basically crushes you instantly. So I'm not really sure what's in store in the gray mirror in terms of getting out of this clown world without using power in the way we would normally think of it in. But I don't know. I think we're on the right path here in terms of what Moldbug is writing now, and I think really everyone needs to go read this stuff at the Gray Mirror. I mean, all the stuff I read was still free, and it really felt to me like reading the open letter again, which is a feeling I haven't had anywhere, even with bio-Leninism, since I read the open letter. Like I really feel like I'm on a new level of red pilled here in terms of how I'm now viewing things. Like which I actually didn't feel 2 hours ago before I read it, right? Like that's how much what he wrote really jived with me in terms of my thinking.
Well, I think that'll definitely help for a good stream. Is that, all these ideas running through your head, you're ready to engage with them. I think that Moldbug's point is probably made best by watching what's happening with Trump right now. So much of the country was invested in this, the MAGA movement, and this was going to be the new hope, the new populist right, and this is going to turn everything around, and Trump was going to come in and not care and do whatever he was going to do. And I think the more as time goes on, as you see Trump unable to shut down the border, unable to do the things he promised he was going to do, unable to even defend his own citizens, and really just give a strong defense in favor of his supporters in a lot of situations, you start to see that what Trump does really is he's just the one last Al Bundy that the Democrats are able to stick in office and use as a boogeyman. He's ineffectual. He's not. He'll get some things passed to please his base, but he's not doing anything that's going to overall change the direction of where we're going and what's happening in the country. And all these ineffectual changes will not actually assault the cathedral's plans, but he does serve as an amazing rallying point for their base, and he does allow them to keep pushing get the last bit of juice out of the narrative of America is a terrible place run by stupid people who hate minorities or whatever, and they get to squeeze that last little bit of the narrative out. And that's a lot of what Yarvin talks about, is when you fight the machine, you just give it the villain it wants, and you're so deep in the machine that even your conception of what it means to oppose the machine is shaped by it. And so as you push back against it, you're just providing the very dragon they've kind of told stories about, and they get to slay that dragon in effigy one more time. And so I think that's a lot of what he's saying is, look, I know it feels good to get someone like Trump in office. I know it makes it feel like a victory. I was as elated as anyone. I thought Trump was completely done. I thought Hillary was going to be president forever. I thought, so I was as giddy as anyone else when he won that election. But that's actually a false hope, and that false hope can send right-wingers down another 20 years of useless action if we let it. And so I think that's a really good way of seeing kind of what he's talking about when it comes to how opposition can actually feed and distract any real change.
Yeah, and I think we all kind of have implicitly come to this understanding just watching what's happened with Trump throughout the last several years. And I think that's actually why what I just read on the Gray Mirror appealed to me so much is because just like with the original open letter, you know, I had the feeling that I sort of already knew this stuff, but I really needed someone to give me a comprehensive system or explanation for all of it, and then I would really understand it explicitly. And I think that's kind of what is going on with the Gray Mirror, is that we sort of implicitly understand that we need to not be engaged with Trump. And even, you know, like in 2016, I kind of actively campaigned for him, basically, right? Whereas now I'm just doing nothing, right? I think what most of us are doing has very little to do with what people would normally consider to be politics, right? I don't engage with politics at all, really, on my channel or really anything I do. Certainly not in the same way that one would have conceived of doing so in 2016. So I think we all sort of implicitly understand this problem. And I think in the near future, we're going to enter into a new understanding of the explicit nature of what's actually going on here and how to get out of it if we really pay attention and really sit down and think and just get our stuff together and stop thrashing. You know, Moldbug uses this thrashing analogy in his new Gray Mirror stuff, and that really does it really hurt a little bit to read that, because it does feel like we're kind of just thrashing. We're all just kind of trying random stuff, honestly, to just see if anything sticks. But the thing is, none of it's going to stick, because no matter what you're doing when you're thrashing, you're just sort of flailing about in the dragon suit for the night to slay, as he says. And, you know, the more you thrash, the more alive and scary you look, and the more this allows the government to excuse what it's doing. And this is exactly what happened with the alt-right in, you know, 2016, 2017, right? I think that's another reason why I found the new stuff so compelling, is because he basically describes exactly what happened with the alt-right without ever really referencing them explicitly at all. So I think we have very good demonstrations of this new thesis he's developing in action. And, you know, I think we really need to be paying attention and thinking about all of these new ideas, because, you know, we do have to figure out some way to solve this problem without being dissidents. That's the real takeaway I've gotten is that we need to get over this idea of being dissidents. You know, I know the term dissident right is pretty popular now as like this catch-all, but being a dissident is not correct, because the dissident is the thing that actually gives the bad guys a boogeyman to go after. And you can't ever defeat this greater sovereign power merely by thrashing against it as some sort of opposition, right? That clearly just doesn't work historically. But we don't have the alternative developed yet. And it's going to take, I think, people a lot smarter than me, at least, to actually figure out what that alternative is. But, you know, I feel like I'm on the path towards understanding it as it's laid out before me, at least.
Well, I think that his final new essay, the one that just came out a few days ago, is actually kind of, it's him dunking on moderates a lot, which is really entertaining. But I think he has some good explanations in there. He talks about the difference between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, and kind of what it means for revolutions. Obviously, we're not looking to be communists here, but what he was saying, and it was basically, look, we're not going. This thing's going to have to all come apart. There are no reforms. There are no half measures. It's either all going to come down at once, or it's not going to come down at all. And so anyone trying to kind of duct tape things back together or roll it back a little bit is going to fail horribly, which is what all the moderates are doing right now. You're seeing all the moderate, which people who were clearly progressive but are just not completely on board with lying and crushing every person who disagrees with them, those people are now starting to get canceled. And so all of a sudden they really care about cancel culture. So people who were canceling literally every human being to their right for their entire careers are suddenly going, hey guys, I don't know, this is such a great idea. And Moldbug is just like, look, this is never going to work. You can't stop this any more than this is like trying to reform a witch trial. It's still a witch trial, and until the whole thing falls apart and just collapses under its own weight, and you're ready to resurrect something entirely new, there's no point wasting your energy trying to make these reforms. They're not going to happen. You either smash the machinery entirely and start again, or you just don't bother and you just prepare for that moment, because if you're doing anything else, you're just biding time for the system.
Yeah, you're actually putting more energy into the system. And I think that's what this clear pulse stuff is really about, is the more we resist actively, the more we're actually adding energy to the system that continues to sustain it just a little longer and accelerates it to just an even worse point. And like the more we actually thrash against it like this, the actual worse it's going to get for us when the thing collapses, because it's sort of on this path where it can't stay together forever, but it can certainly take a lot of duct tape, right, before it actually comes apart. And that's all everyone is doing right now. The entire society is just politically energized, even the moderates at this point. And this is going to lead to magnitudes greater thrashing. That's kind of what I worry about, is like, if we thought Trump was divisive and energizing, I think we might be entering a phase here of mass activism, with the acceleration of canceling and these riots and all of this. And if we don't actually get people en masse to disengage from this, it's going to get really ugly for everyone, basically, right? Not just collaborators and dissidents, but literally the whole of civilization.
Absolutely. And this is actually something I've been doing in my personal life, is trying to reach out to people who I know who are kind of hitting that wall. Because, yeah, there's absolutely like a whole section. It's the vast majority of conservatives, kind of talk radio conservatives. There's a whole bunch of boomer cons who are all hitting the wall simultaneously. Like their entire worldview is collapsing around them. The Constitution doesn't work anymore, and it's getting harder and harder to pretend it does. I teach American government, so I'm going to have a really interesting fall. Because I don't know what to say. So this is in theory how the First Amendment is in theory going to work. It doesn't apply, but just, you need to be able to answer this on the test. But yeah, it's just a lot of people are going to hit the wall with this stuff, and they have nothing. It's hard enough for us to grasp. If they have nothing, they have nothing that gives them an actual critique of power, actually gives them something to hold on to and to understand what's happening. And so I do think that actually that if we want a really good project that disengages us from politics but serves our community and our country, is probably developing ways to reach kind of these more traditional conservatives with this understanding before they start acting out. Because trust me, the Glenn Beck guy with an entire closet of guns is not going quietly.
That's the thing we don't want. Exactly. That's the worst thing that can happen.
but it's gonna come, right? Like I hate to blackpill everybody.
We can all feel it coming, I think, and that's very scary.
Absolutely. So I think that one of our missions for this community, as loose as it is, but whatever community we built up, I think one of our missions might need to be like figuring like an adopt a NormieCon program. Like find the people in your life who are going to hit the wall with this stuff. Because when it comes, like you say, it's only going to feed the system, and it's only going to make it worse, because it's going to give them the real enemies they keep pretending exist now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And yeah, this is something I've been doing too, to some extent. Like, my friends are always, no, not always, but politics tends to come up in the Discord, like basically every day. Right. And I even know a few people who have gone to protests and stuff. And I'm always just like, guys, why are you even doing any of this? Just stop. Let's just play video games or something. Like, what are you doing? You don't even know what you're doing. You're just wasting your energy, and you're actually just making it worse by trying to engage with the thing. Just let it do what it's doing. It's Moldbug's expat analogy works really well here. I don't even know if it originally comes from him, but just the idea of think of yourself as an expat in a place where you don't even have any business being involved in the government, right? Like if you retired to Costa Rica, right? You're not Costa Rican. Like you don't have any, you wouldn't feel like you had any right to say how Costa Rica should be run. You're just kind of a guest there. And that's really the situation in every country at this point, is we're more or less guests of the regime at this point. Not because that's how it should be, but that's just how it is, right? And so acting like it cares about us at all and that we can actually engage with it in good faith is just completely absurd. It's like if you were playing a game of Civilization and like some other civ stumbled upon you and they had like multiple levels of technology ahead of you, and expecting them to just like let you wait to upgrade. That way it could be a fair fight. Like that's not going to happen. We're not fighting in a fair fight. We're fighting, even if you're on the left, right? The fight is so unfair that it's literally unwinnable. But there is a way out, right? The way out is to allow it to die, because that will actually happen. This regime can actually just die under its own devices if you stop feeding it, stop empowering it. But spreading this message, this is probably the hardest message to spread to people. Moldbug describes it like Zen, and non-committal takes a lot of non-commitment actually takes a lot of commitment to do, right? Like it's very hard. You really have to willfully disengage from things. Disengagement sounds easy, but it's actually not. It's probably the most difficult thing you can do when all of the social factors try to force you to be engaged. And I mean, really, we're at the point where, even a few years ago, you could kind of be like a passive person who didn't really take sides. But now, as Moldbug wrote, everyone's a collaborator or dissonant. You sort of have to pick a side because the system's making you pick a side. But you shouldn't do that. But it's ever more difficult to actually do that disengagement. So it's a very difficult message to sell, but I think it really is the only way out for us that is really going to work.
Well, I think one really great piece of wisdom that he had, and I want to say the gentle introduction or something, was he talks about becoming worthy. And he says, becoming worthy is the hardest thing you'll ever do, and most of you will never do it because it's really, really hard. And it's really easy to show up to a protest and hold a sign. And it's really easy to make an angry Facebook post online. It's really hard to read a lot and work out a lot and build a family and like better yourself to the point where you're worthy of leadership. And so a lot of people are motivated to do the easy thing because at least it's something to do. And it gives you an immediate feedback. The pornography analogy is always great with this. Like it's that quick hit of something that makes you feel the dopamine rush, but in the end doesn't really matter and isn't really making any headway. And so it's much harder to instead step back, realize you don't have power, and realize the only way you're going to get power is to become worthy of power. And so I think that's never going to be a popular message because discipline is a much less popular message than heroin. But I think it's a necessary one. And I think as people burn out on the heroin, they're going to look somewhere else. And so I think that is a really powerful piece of wisdom by him, and something that we should always probably be remembering when we're trying to figure out our next step is if we're bettering ourselves and bettering our community and building our relationships and our networks and improving ourselves, then when our time comes, we'll be in a position to make a difference. Because I watched, I'm not a big Nick Fuentes fan, but I saw one of his videos, and he was he's like, a lot of people are asking me, what's the way forward? What's the way forward on this? What's the difference? And he's like, there isn't one right now. There isn't a good answer right now. So the best thing we can do is just get better and be like better and stronger and grow. And then when our time comes, we'll be ready. But right now there just isn't a good answer. And I know people hate that, but like, that's the truth. And I could lie to you, or you can just do better.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good way to put it. Cause like, it really does feel like people doing, like I saw there was a message in chat I wanted to address, but it looks like it's deleted now. But it was saying something along the lines of, oh yeah, that was it right there. Haha, gotcha. So yeah, it does feel like giving up, right? But and we don't know what to engage into yet, but that's okay. The most important thing is to stop doing what's obviously wrong. And we actually have a good idea at this point of what is obviously wrong. So we have a lot of progress to make just on that front. So the fact that we don't know exactly what we're going to do next, it doesn't really matter. We'll figure it out. But to get there, we have to stop making mistakes. And I think Nick Fuentes actually has a really good grasp on that, which is why, he isn't really involved in much of what you would call activism. I mean, sometimes he goes out and, goes to an event or something, or like gives a live talk, but, and trolls a little bit. But he mostly just talks in the show, right? And that's fine for now. Like, he doesn't need to be doing something as we think of it, because if you try to do something, the Cathedral will just smash you to smithereens, and that's what would happen to Nick Fuentes if you actually try to do anything.
Yeah, well, I mean, they put him on that MTV interview, which was like disastrous for him, right? So, like, I believe that was what it was, right? It was an MTV interview, but
yeah, it was.
But yeah, never. As someone who's a reporter, guys, never trust the media. Don't talk to people like me. That's a mistake. They're not there for you. They're not there to tell your story. Yours won't be the one that brings people around. Don't engage with these people. It's never worth it. And they're, no matter how much they promise you it's going to be sympathetic or positive, it will not be. That's not what gets the headlines. That's not what moves their career forward.
So I think interestingly is this message of detachment actually can appeal, I think, very obviously to Christians and libertarians. I mean, libertarians, particularly on the low time preference front. I mean, what we're basically asking is for people to engage in low time preference behavior. It's not that we don't have some sort of goal to go towards, but that it's something that has to be done carefully and over a long period of time with a bigger payoff at the end. And then, for I think Catholics, Christians are understand as well this concept of low time preference behavior, right? I mean, this can very obviously congeal with the Christian worldview, and not just doing whatever feels good at the time just because it feels like you're doing something. So I think we have a lot of the intellectual basis on the right wing to get this message out there. The hardest part is going to be getting it to the moderates, or just the sort of conservative mass of people, like the guy with all the guns you mentioned earlier that we don't want going off. Those are the harder people to get to, because they're just not as plugged in as much, and they're just not thinking about these things as much because they're still more or less constrained to within what the system allows them to think about.
Yeah, and I think the Christian point's really good, because the oldest sin in the book is trying to be in control, right? That's the story of the Bible is people who thought they could figure it out for God, and so one of the cardinal sins is trying to pretend like you're in control of your life when you're not, and so I do think there's something to be said about, look, if you trust in God, then do the things you're supposed to be doing, better yourself, and look for the opportunities that may be opened up for you. But in the end, that's where these things are going to go. But that was the last thing I wanted to touch on you with this about is, and we're coming up on an hour, so feel, if you need to bow out, feel free just to let me know. But the last thing I did want to touch on, at least that I had written down, was one thing I do think a lot of people who are listening to us talk about this will ask, because it's the first thing I asked when I first encountered this from Moldbug, and this idea of disengagement is, Moldbug seems really plugged into this theory that America is just going to go the route of like Eastern Bloc Europe after the USSR, and things are just going to kind of peacefully dissolve as people get tired with the system that just clearly doesn't work. And obviously that's like the ideal situation for all of us, right? Is like everyone just kind of turns to each other and says, so we don't have to do this anymore. And they're like, no. And then we just kind of walk away. But I will say this, and I fully support this project, but there is a bit of Moldbug's pacifism here that I think makes him like just say that, well, things will just collapse because they're going to. And I think if we look at history, we know that's not usually how that works. It would be nice if it has it works. That's how I hope it works. And so some people might think to themselves, what does this mean if it doesn't go that way?
Yeah, I think the pacifist criticism is the best criticism of Moldbug. He is very pacifist oriented, I think, to a fault. It's understandable having this deep desire for people to just not be in conflict with each other. But I think that desire sometimes influences, his logical conceptions, where he seems to, I understand why he thinks this, right? So he thinks that there's not really enough energy left in America to actually have some sort of revolution, right? Because people are just so comfortable and just sort of docile now. But I'm not really sure that that's true, because I think this is sort of in conflict with human nature, and I think you can. To me, it's not out of the box to imagine people sort of going off en masse. Like, it's kind of only one side doing it right now, and only to a small degree, honestly. Like, only the left is really going off to any significant degree, and it's still tiny compared to even recent history. But all it takes is a few events to happen that ramp up the violence, right, and really cause people to just go at each other's throats in a way we wouldn't have thought possible. I think we're a lot closer to something like that happening than we would be comfortable, right? So it's just something to keep in mind, that don't get complacent and think that we're just sort of eminently safe because modernity, right? Because I don't really think that's true.
Yeah, I think there's stop me if you guys are history fans, stop me if you've heard this one before, but a bunch of soldiers were standing around and protesters were getting really angry and they got surrounded, and then somebody threw something and hit the soldier in the head, and then the soldier fired into the crowd. Because what I just described is literally every revolution that started for the last 400 years.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, it's so easy for one twitch of a finger to do just that little right thing that sets everything in motion, right? And so, we have to be cognizant that things could get really bad really fast, and not to just sort of default to this assumption Moldbug seems to be putting out, that it's kind of just an almost certainty that no revolution like that would happen. Because I think it definitely could. And it certainly wouldn't be pretty for literally anyone. I mean, it would just be bad all around for something like that to happen.
Yeah, and I want him to be right, because I have a family, and I know what comes next. I've seen this movie a lot when it comes to history, and nobody has to think very hard to know that even if you think the cause is righteous, if things really do break down, it's not just going to be bad for you. It's going to be bad for everybody in a very visceral way. And so I want to do everything I can to, make things go down the Moldbug path of that, of hopefully that kind of just soft collapse and rebirth, because the other path is just really bad, and I have an investment in not wanting that to happen, but it is also important not to pull the wool over our eyes, and to just live in this world where, things will get bad enough and everyone will just give up, and they'll be like, all right, you seem to know what you're doing, business CEO guy, you run the country. That's in many ways, I feel like a fantasy that Yarvin used to embrace, and I'm hoping that as he develops his ideas more in the gray mirror, we'll see something a little more realistic coming about from that.
Yeah, I mean, we saw I forget the names of the lawyers or whatever who came out with their guns in front of the protesters, right? Like, I think don't underestimate how much angrier I guess your Republicans in many parts of the country can get in the face of all of this stuff, especially once they stop believing in the American principles that we're supposed to have. Like, the more energy we keep dumping into this, combined with the more people who sort of become disillusioned with what we have, I think increases the chances of something really bad happening, which I think is the main argument for detachment, right? Because people are going to become disillusioned. So the only other variable we have control over is how much, at least at an individual level, is how much energy is being put into the system. So I think Moldbug is right, is that if there isn't enough energy in it, that we will get the pacifist solution. But that means a very explicit and coordinated effort on our part to actually demobilize and detach people from this system.
And that's really tough because things are going to get really bad. One of the guys in the comments was saying, they're focusing on immutable characteristics like race. How are you going to be detached and disengaged at that point? And especially again, if you've got kids, you got a family, that becomes a much harder question because white fragility book is going to flood every educational institution this fall. I guarantee you, and it's going to get taught to your kids, and it's going to be very hard to sit back and watch that happen. And I think a lot of people, are going to have a very hard time struggling with disengagement once they start seeing their country actively turn against them that way.
Yeah, well, and I think too, like things are probably going to only get worse for like 20 years or something like that, at least I would imagine. And that might seem blackpilling, but actually that's not too bad, right? I mean, like 20 years isn't really that much time. And if you're really in for this for the principles and not just like your personal self-interest, which it's hard to imagine anyone being on the right at this point for self-interest, but that shouldn't really bother you, right? Because on a civilizational scale, 20 years isn't really that long. So if it really does take us that long to get anywhere, that's just we can deal with it.
And one of the things I think that's interesting that Yarvin, one of the things he's famous for is kind of the left wing is entropy. Cthulhu swims left, and so it feels inevitable because leftism is basically society breaking down slow motion style. And so one of his points was the things that work for right wingers or that work for left wingers can't possibly work for right wingers because, if you're building something, if you're establishing standards, if you're building civilization, you can't count on the same forces that left-wing people do. So all the propaganda you've ever watched about Mr. Smith going to Washington and holding your protests and standing up at the community meeting and making the big speech and voting your guy into office, like all that incremental stuff that works for the left works because the left is always just slowly eroding norms. They're just slowly breaking down civilization. And so the water, if dripped long enough on the rock, does wear the rock away. But the right can't do this. And so because the right has to build in a very energetic fashion, it cannot rely on this political entropy. And therefore, this idea of activism, the way we've been trained to think about it in America and much of the West, doesn't work for the right.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this can lead people to detachment once they understand that this whole idea of symmetrical warfare doesn't really work in the system we have now. Like, if the left is fire and is this entropic force that burns things down, the right can't light an anti-fire that just magically puts everything back together, right? That's not how it works. You have to clean up the mess and then just rebuild everything through a lot more manual means. You can't ever hold an anti-fire to the left's fire. We just can't fight with the same tools or on the same principles because that's not the game that's being played.
Absolutely. And, that's, I'm trying to remember, I think he was talking about the Project Veritas guy, James O'Keefe. He was talking about James O'Keefe and someone was asking him like, oh, are you happy to see this? And he's like, no, he's trying to be Saul Alinsky for the right. And the right can't have a Saul Alinsky, because all of Alinsky's rules are exactly against the right principles. And so if you follow those rules to fight the left, you're just becoming the left. You're just feeding them their own propaganda back to them. You're not building anything right wing. You're just adopting those tactics, and they're just not going to work the same way for the right when it comes to this. And so the detachment does become important.
That actually reminds me. I just watched this interview that was really interesting with James O'Keefe on Eric Weinstein's show, of all places, on the Portal. And Eric Weinstein kind of sucks, and but it was interesting to watch this interview because it was actually a very good interview with O'Keefe, and I would definitely recommend people watch it. And the most interesting part, I think, was watching Eric sort of understand the Cathedral without having the tools to think about it, because he is a really intelligent guy, and he basically can't help but find the Cathedral. But the problem is his ideology, right? Like, he can't quite let go of the progressive ideology, and this is actually something I've seen before. And I'm not trying to say that like leftists can be converted or something, but nonetheless, it's sort of interesting to watch people who are obviously on the left sort of discover the same thing we're talking about it, but because they are so trapped within this religious frame, they can't truly ever oppose the Cathedral, even though they more or less see it.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up, because I have a theory about Weinstein. And the theory is this, because I used to think a lot of what you were thinking about Weinstein is like he's a left winger, but he gets some of these things, and but he can't like articulate it properly because he can't get outside of his own box. And I've come to believe that actually I think he does understand it. I think he does get it. And I think what he's trying to do is forestall it. I think Weinstein is the smartest left winger in the room. He understands that the left has broken the machine it built, and that it will eventually collapse unless it gets reformed. And what he's trying to do is stop the reaction. He's trying to stop people from moving rightward. He's trying to stop people from moving towards, kind of out of the system. He's trying to trap people back in the system because I think, unlike many other left wingers, he will take on some of the obvious topics, things like immigration, that obviously hurt the country and are just too obvious, because he knows that if he can get the left to come back to where they used to be on some of those issues, he might be able to preserve neoliberalism for a couple more generations. I think he's entirely sold on the neoliberal project, and I think he understands exactly how it works, and he's trying to cut this off at the pass before the left drives itself off the road.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that Eric Weinstein is operating on like actual 4D chess levels, and I think the guy is obviously intelligent enough to do that. That's really interesting, and that is actually a pretty good theory. And I mean, he is one of the people who profits most from neoliberalism, basically. I mean, he's a very intelligent university professor who basically does, as far as I can tell, non-productive theoretical labor that doesn't really amount to anything, nevertheless can make a lot of money off of it. So yeah, that's a pretty interesting theory. And I would say that makes him very dangerous, because the longer you prolong the reaction, or whatever you want to call it, the worse it's going to be, because sustaining this thing, maybe selfishly from his point of view, maybe he just doesn't care, right? But sustaining this thing for another 70, 80 years, I think is just going to make things a whole lot worse, way worse than we could ever imagine.
Well, and that's what a lot of what Moldbug attacks in that very last essay is. He attacks a lot of the IDW types on kind of patching things, like trying to save parts of the liberal project as it goes down, and thinking that they can turn it around at the last second. I think some guys like Dave Rubin are just they're not theorists, so they're just doing it because they genuinely bought into the propaganda and are trying to save the sinking ship. But I think Weinstein, I think he really is. I think there's a reason he's kind of leading that edge, because I think he does get it. I think he does get it, and he's trying to turn that around. But like I said, I didn't want to keep you too long. If did you have if you want to keep going on this line, or if you had something else you wanted to address too, but I don't want to tie you up for too long. We've been talking for over an hour, so if you have anything else you want to address, I'm more than happy to keep going. But
yeah, we can wrap up. I mean, the last thing I'll say on this is I think trying to patch neoliberalism is basically trying to patch Windows. Like, you can't fix Windows. You have to just get rid of it, right? I mean, and I mean the operating system, not a literal window, right? Like, this isn't a system that you can just sort of tinker with and fix. It's fundamentally broken at the root level. And just like the Windows operating system, the more you add and add to it and try to make it work, actually it just gets way worse in the long run. So I think that approach is just fundamentally flawed and really dangerous. And yeah, I think Eric Weinstein is probably the only really serious person in the intellectual dark web at this point, I think. I mean, maybe Peterson could have been at some point, but people like Dave Rubin certainly aren't, and Sam Harris and whoever else, Joe Rogan, they're all stuck, in like 2010 or something, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we do need to pay attention to what Eric is doing on his show, because it could be a legitimate threat to us. Although his audience seems pretty intelligent. The most interesting thing about that interview he did with O'Keefe was actually the comment section. If you look at the comment section, basically everyone was very much against Eric Weinstein because they identified him as sort of holding this ridiculous idea of reform. And here he was basically criticizing an actual reformer because his methods weren't perfect enough, right? So I'm skeptical that his project, if you're right about what he's doing, will actually work, which is a good sign.
I agree. And I think one of the problems that you have to remember who's engaging with this stuff. And while we might not find parts of the audience intelligent, comparatively, they're wildly intelligent to like the rest of the population. Like your average person going to Walmart doesn't know who Eric Weinstein is, and surely isn't listening to 2-hour conversations about like political theory. And so they're not engaging with it. And so one of the things that I think we need to understand is, there's a lot of talk of elites when it comes to neoreactionary and thought, and rightly so, because elites do shape the world, and engaging with the elite class is the way to make change. But I think what people also need to understand is there's a lot of 150 IQ mild autists talking to each other when we're doing this stuff, and we don't always have the best grasp of what the guy in the street is understanding.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there needs to be an onboarding of social intelligence along with the political theory and the power analysis, because as we talk to people, we certainly want to be focused on elites when it comes, we want to recruit people of quality, but eventually the zeitgeist of the country has to change. Eventually the general understanding and values of the country has to change. And yes, they'll follow elites, but they'll follow elites who can speak their language, which means you need to have people who are able to bridge that gap between, theoretical physicists having, discussions about political theory and the average person who's actually going to be involved living everyday life in the country.
Yeah. And I guess just one last point here. I think in terms of overcoming autism, women are actually really important in this, because they understand a lot better, particularly better than weirdos like us do, about how to have productive social interactions and build social connections with people. And it's really important to have them involved in the IRL level, not the internet level. And so, if you're doing any like social events, like I mentioned earlier, you want to have women involved and not to just have a bunch of like autistic dudes there. And I think you see this in something like Patriotic Alternative in Britain, right? I think the combination of Mark Collette and Laura Towler is actually really powerful, because, Collette can appeal to people like us. I have disagreements with some of his methods, to be sure, but I think having someone like Laura Towler there very present is going to help a lot on the ground level activity. And I think that's a model people really ought to pay attention to, even in their small social groups, is the value of having women help build proper social connections with other people.
Absolutely. I mean, they're the glue that forms society, or men would not have come together and interacted with each other had they not needed to figure it out for women. to pay attention to them. So yeah, absolutely. You need that civilizing effect. You need that personal touch. A den mother will hold your group together much better than a bunch of guys who have read the newest Yarvin essay. And so I am absolutely 100% on board with that, which is why I think it's so important to plug people in your personal life. You need to start reaching out to people. You need to start making them aware. You don't need to download them the entirety of unqualified reservations, into their brain in a sitting. But it's time to start breaching those conversations ever so gently with people who do have those skills. And do see some of the problems, because you're going to need them as you organize in real life.
All right. Well, we are coming up on the 90-minute mark, which I think is the optimal stream length. So unless there's anything else, I think this was a really productive stream and a good conversation overall.
Yeah, man, absolutely. I really appreciate you coming on. Like I said, big fan of your work. I think anyone who wants to either just get the most important parts of Neoreaction, or wants to prep themselves before they go into the deep dive should absolutely be checking out your channel. I've got your channel and your Twitter information in the description. I've got my Twitter information if people want to follow me there. And there you can, if you just found the channel and want to hit subscribe, I really appreciate it. But I really appreciate you coming on, man. I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, and see you around.
Absolutely.